Imagine standing on the deck of a rusted American destroyer in September 1940, watching as the stars and stripes are lowered for the last time. Within hours, this vessel will fly the white ensign of the Royal Navy. Britain is bleeding. Her cities burn under German bombs. Her convoy ships sink daily in the Atlantic. And America, still clinging to neutrality, is about to make a deal that will change everything. This is the story of destroyers for bases, the secret bargain that saved Britain, bent the rules of war, and set America on an irreversible path toward global conflict. Welcome to a journey through one of World War II's most crucial, yet overlooked chapters. Before Pearl Harbor, before D-Day, before America officially entered the war, Franklin Roosevelt made a choice that would define the century. It wasn't a declaration of war. It wasn't a treaty signed in marble halls. It was a handshake deal for 50 old ships that would determine whether democracy survived or fell to fascism. The year is 1940, and the world is watching Britain die. Let me take you back to understand how desperate the situation truly was. Just months earlier, Hitler's forces had torn through Europe like a wildfire through dry grass. Poland fell in weeks. Denmark surrendered in hours. Norway fought bravely but couldn't hold. Then came the shock that made the world gasp. France, the mighty French Republic with its legendary Maginot Line and massive army, collapsed in just 6 weeks. Think about that for a moment. France had been considered one of the world's great military powers. They had more tanks than Germany. They had battle-tested generals. They had the scars and memories of World War I to guide them. And yet, the German blitzkrieg shattered them so completely that by June 1940, Nazi officers were posing for photographs in front of the Eiffel Tower. Britain now stood alone. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped from Dunkirk, leaving behind virtually all their heavy equipment. Tens of thousands of small boats had ferried over 300,000 soldiers across the English Channel in a retreat that Churchill himself called a miracle wrapped in disaster. The men were saved, yes, but they came home without their tanks, without their artillery, without their transport vehicles. Britain's army was intact but nearly unarmed. And then came the air war. The Battle of Britain raged through the summer skies. Young RAF pilots, many barely out of their teens, climbed into their Spitfires and Hurricanes day after day, knowing that each sortie might be their last. The mathematics were brutal. Germany had more planes, more pilots, more resources. For every German aircraft shot down, Britain struggled to replace the pilot and machine they lost in return. But it was at sea where Britain faced her most existential threat. The Battle of the Atlantic was becoming a slaughter. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes like wolves among sheep. Every week, dozens of merchant ships went to the bottom, taking with them the food, fuel, and materials that Britain desperately needed to survive. Britain is an island nation. She cannot feed herself. She cannot arm herself. She cannot fuel herself without imports. And those imports had to cross 3,000 miles of ocean infested with submarines. Here's where the numbers become terrifying. At the outbreak of war, the Royal Navy had around 200 destroyers. These swift, versatile warships were the workhorses of convoy protection. They could detect submarines, drop depth charges, and screen the vulnerable merchant vessels. But by the summer of 1940, more than half of those destroyers were gone. Sunk by U-boats, damaged by German aircraft, worn out by constant operations. Britain was building new destroyers as fast as she could, but construction takes time. A destroyer requires a year or more to build. Britain had months, perhaps weeks, before her convoy system collapsed entirely. Winston Churchill understood this better than anyone. The Prime Minister had served as First Lord of the Admiralty in World War I. He knew naval warfare intimately. He knew that if the Atlantic lifeline was cut, Britain would starve into surrender without Germany ever needing to invade. In his memoirs, Churchill would later write that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. So Churchill did what he had to do. He swallowed British pride and asked America for help. Not as a beggar, but not quite as an equal either. Britain's position was too desperate for dignity. In May 1940, just days after becoming Prime Minister, Churchill sent the first of what would become hundreds of personal messages to Franklin Roosevelt. These weren't formal diplomatic communications. They were intimate, urgent letters from one leader to another. Churchill signed them as former naval person, a reference to his time at the Admiralty, knowing that Roosevelt, who had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, would appreciate the connection. Churchill's request was specific. He needed destroyers. Old ones would do. America had dozens of destroyers left over from World War I, sitting in reserve. They weren't modern ships, but they could hunt submarines and escort convoys. Churchill asked for 50 or 60 of these vessels, promising they would make all the difference between survival and defeat. Now let's cross the Atlantic and understand Franklin Roosevelt's dilemma. Roosevelt knew Britain needed help. He personally wanted to help. But America in 1940 was a deeply isolationist nation. The memory of World War I still haunted the American consciousness. Over 100,000 Americans had died in that conflict. And for what? To make the world safe for democracy? Well, democracy hadn't exactly flourished in the aftermath. Instead came economic depression, the rise of dictators, and now another European war. The isolationist movement in America was powerful and vocal. Groups like the America First Committee commanded huge support. Prominent figures like Charles Lindbergh argued passionately that America should stay out of Europe's endless quarrels. Public opinion polls showed that while Americans sympathized with Britain, an overwhelming majority opposed entering the war. Roosevelt faced a political minefield, but Roosevelt was also a political genius and a strategic thinker. He understood that if Britain fell, America would face a world dominated by hostile totalitarian powers. Hitler in Europe, Stalin in Russia, Imperial Japan in Asia. The balance of power that had protected American security for generations would shatter. America would find herself isolated, threatened, and eventually forced to fight anyway, but under far worse circumstances. So Roosevelt looked for ways to help Britain without technically violating American neutrality laws. These laws, passed in the late 1930s, were designed to keep America out of foreign wars. They prohibited selling weapons to belligerent nations, banned American ships from war zones, and restricted loans to countries at war. The laws tied Roosevelt's hands, but he was determined to find a way through the knots. The destroyer idea appealed to Roosevelt for several reasons. First, these were old ships that the Navy wasn't using anyway. Second, he could potentially frame the transfer not as military aid, but as a trade, a deal that benefited American security. And third, acting through executive authority might allow him to bypass Congress entirely, avoiding a political battle he might lose. But how could transferring 50 destroyers to a nation actively at war be considered neutral? Roosevelt needed legal cover, and he needed something to show the American people in return. This is where the genius and controversy of the destroyers for bases deal emerges. The British Empire still controlled strategic territories throughout the Atlantic and Caribbean. Small islands, mostly, but islands with deep harbors and airfields. Places like Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, and British Guiana. These locations could serve as American military bases, extending the defensive perimeter of the United States far beyond its shores. Roosevelt's advisors realized these bases could be the key. If Britain leased these territories to America for 99 years, then the destroyer transfer could be presented not as a gift, but as a purchase. America would be trading old ships for valuable real estate. The deal would strengthen American defenses. It could even be argued that America was getting the better end of the bargain. The negotiations took place throughout the summer of 1940, conducted in secret through various diplomatic channels. Churchill desperately wanted the destroyers, but bristled at some American demands. The British Empire was not for sale, he insisted. These were sovereign territories, not merchandise to be bartered. Churchill worried about the symbolism of appearing to auction off British possessions to stay afloat. Roosevelt pushed hard. He knew the American public needed to see tangible benefits. His advisors drafted and redrafted the terms. Some bases would be given freely as a gesture of solidarity. Others would be exchanged for the destroyers. The legal language had to be precise enough to withstand scrutiny, but flexible enough to satisfy both sides. Behind the scenes, American military and legal officials debated whether Roosevelt even had the authority to make such a deal without congressional approval. The Attorney General Robert Jackson produced a lengthy legal opinion arguing that yes, as Commander-in-Chief, Roosevelt could dispose of obsolete military equipment as he saw fit, especially if doing so enhanced American security. Critics called this opinion a stretch at best, a dangerous expansion of executive power at worst. By late August, the terms were finalized. Britain would lease 8 base locations to the United States for 99 years. In return, America would transfer 50 flush-deck destroyers from World War I. These ships, also called four-stackers because of their distinctive 4 smokestacks, were obsolete by modern standards, but still capable of anti-submarine warfare. On September 2, 1940, the deal was announced publicly. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Interventionists cheered. Roosevelt had found a way to aid Britain without going to war. He had strengthened American defenses. He had shown dictators that America would support democracy. Isolationists howled in protest. Roosevelt had committed an act of war, they argued. He had violated neutrality. He had usurped congressional authority. He had brought America one step closer to joining the slaughter. The press coverage was intense. Some newspapers praised Roosevelt's bold leadership. Others condemned what they called a dictatorial power grab. The 1940 presidential election was just 2 months away, and Roosevelt's Republican opponent, Wendell Willkie, had to decide how to respond. Willkie generally supported aid to Britain, but criticized the secretive way Roosevelt had conducted the deal. It became a major campaign issue. Now let's talk about the ships themselves, because these destroyers have their own fascinating story. They were built rapidly during and just after World War I, when America was desperately trying to counter German U-boats. Between 1917 and 1921, American shipyards produced over 200 flush-deck destroyers. They were relatively small, around 1,500 tons, with a top speed of 35 knots. They carried 4-inch guns and torpedo tubes and depth charges for anti-submarine work. But by 1940, these ships were 20 years old. In naval terms, that's ancient. They were worn out from years of service. Their machinery was tired. Their designs were outdated. The American Navy had long since built newer, better destroyers and considered these four-stackers obsolete. Many had been in mothballs for years, tied up at Navy yards with minimal maintenance. When the British crews arrived to take possession of their new ships, they found vessels in various states of readiness. Some were in reasonable condition. Others were barely floating rust buckets. The British sailors, grateful but realistic, dubbed them with nicknames. They called them the Four Pipers, or less charitably, the decrepit old ladies. There were jokes that the ships might sink before they reached England. The transfer process was a logistical challenge. American crews had to get the ships ready for handover. British crews had to sail across the Atlantic to take possession. The first transfers took place in early September at naval bases in the United States and Canada. Ceremonies were kept low-key, given the political sensitivities. The American flag came down. The British white ensign went up. And just like that, USS Buchanan became HMS Campbellton, USS Wicks became HMS Montgomery, and 48 others underwent similar transformations. The British gave these ships names of towns and cities from both Britain and America, a symbolic gesture emphasizing the partnership. HMS Castleton, HMS Chelsea, HMS Georgetown, HMS Newport. Each name represented a connection between the two nations, a bridge across the Atlantic built of steel and desperation. Once in British service, these destroyers immediately went to work. They were thrown into the Battle of the Atlantic without time for extensive refitting or training. British and Canadian crews learned their quirks on the job. The ships handled differently than British destroyers. The equipment was unfamiliar. The gun systems operated on different procedures. But there was no time for practice. Convoys were sailing. U-boats were hunting. Every available escort vessel was needed now. The destroyers performed with mixed results. They were slow by 1940 standards. Their anti-aircraft armament was weak, a serious problem given the threat from German aircraft. Their range was limited. They broke down frequently. But they were there, and that mattered enormously. Even an old destroyer could detect a submarine and force it to dive, disrupting an attack. Even an obsolete ship could add another set of eyes to a convoy screen. Some of these destroyers became quite famous. HMS Campbellton, originally USS Buchanan, was packed with explosives in 1942 and rammed into the gates of the dry dock at Saint-Nazaire, France, in one of the most daring commando raids of the war. The ship exploded hours later, destroying the dock and trapping the German battleship Tirpitz in northern waters for lack of a refit facility. HMS Castleton, originally USS Aaron Ward, served throughout the war in convoy escort and anti-submarine roles. Several of the destroyers were lost in action, torpedoed by the very U-boats they hunted. But the real importance of the destroyers for base's deal went far beyond 50 old ships. This agreement was a turning point in American policy and Anglo-American relations. It marked the moment when America abandoned any pretense of strict neutrality. Roosevelt had chosen sides. He had decided that Britain's survival mattered to American security. That decision would lead inevitably toward deeper involvement. 3 months after the destroyer deal, Roosevelt proposed Lend-Lease, a program that would provide billions of dollars worth of war materials to Britain and eventually other allies. The logic was the same. America's security depended on preventing Nazi domination of Europe. Better to supply Britain's fight than to fight alone later. Lend-Lease passed Congress in March 1941, transforming America into what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. The bases acquired through the deal also proved strategically valuable. American forces used these Atlantic outposts throughout the war for anti-submarine patrols, convoy escorts, and air ferry routes. The base in Newfoundland became a crucial link in the aerial supply chain to Britain. The Caribbean bases helped protect the Panama Canal and Caribbean sea lanes. After the war, some of these facilities remained important to American military infrastructure during the Cold War. The deal also set a precedent for executive action in foreign affairs. Roosevelt had demonstrated that a president could make significant international commitments without congressional approval by framing them as executive agreements rather than treaties. This expanded presidential power in ways that continue to resonate today. Every modern president who has committed American forces or resources abroad without explicit congressional declaration of war owes something to the legal arguments that justified the destroyer deal. For Britain, the destroyers themselves were less important than what they represented. They were proof that America would not stand by and watch democracy perish. They were a signal to Hitler that Britain had a powerful friend. They boosted British morale at a moment of maximum peril. Churchill called the destroyer deal a sign that America was moving ever closer to Britain's side. He was right, but we should also acknowledge the controversy and criticism. Many Americans genuinely believed that Roosevelt had overstepped his authority. They argued that only Congress had the power to make such momentous decisions. They feared that Roosevelt was maneuvering America into war through the back door, without the public debate and democratic consent that such a decision deserved. These weren't unreasonable concerns. Roosevelt was indeed maneuvering America toward war, believing it was necessary, but knowing the public wasn't ready to accept it openly. There's also a harder truth about the deal. Britain was desperate, and America drove a hard bargain. The 99-year leases were exceptionally generous terms for the United States. Britain was trading sovereign territory for ships she urgently needed to survive. Some historians have noted that Roosevelt squeezed concessions from Churchill that Britain would never have accepted under less desperate circumstances. It was not charity. It was a transaction between unequal partners at an unequal moment. Churchill himself had mixed feelings. He needed the destroyers desperately, so he agreed to the terms. But he also understood the implications. Britain, the great empire on which the sun never set, was now dependent on American support. The balance of power between Britain and America had fundamentally shifted. After the war, Churchill would reflect that the destroyer deal was the moment when Britain accepted that she could not stand alone, that American power had eclipsed British power, that the torch of Western leadership was passing across the Atlantic. Let's also consider the German perspective. Hitler watched the destroyer deal with intense interest. He recognized it as a clear indication that America was tilting toward Britain. German propaganda denounced it as a violation of neutrality and proof of Roosevelt's secret warmongering. Hitler had hoped that America would stay neutral, allowing him to defeat Britain without interference. The destroyer deal made clear that hope was fading. It influenced German strategic thinking, including eventually the disastrous decision to declare war on America after Pearl Harbor. From a purely naval standpoint, historians debate how much difference 50 old destroyers actually made. The Royal Navy historian John Winton calculated that these ships contributed perhaps 5% of Britain's escort strength during their years of service. They helped, certainly, but they weren't decisive by themselves. The real battle of the Atlantic would be won through a combination of factors including better tactics, improved technology like radar and sonar, breaking German codes, air cover from long-range aircraft, and the massive shipbuilding capacity of American yards. But again, the ships themselves were never really the point. The point was American commitment. The point was Roosevelt finding a way to support Britain despite isolationist opposition. The point was laying the groundwork for the alliance that would eventually win the war. As 1940 turned to 1941, the partnership deepened. Churchill and Roosevelt began meeting in person. The Atlantic Charter was drafted, outlining shared principles for the post-war world. American naval vessels started escorting convoys partway across the Atlantic, engaging in an undeclared naval war with German U-boats. American factories ramped up production of weapons and supplies for Britain. America was at war in everything but name by the fall of 1941. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American Pacific Fleet, and suddenly the debate was over. America was at war. The isolationists had lost. Roosevelt's careful maneuvering over the previous year had prepared America's military and industrial base for the fight. The destroyers' deal, Lend-Lease, the base agreements, all of it now formed the foundation of the Grand Alliance between America and Britain. Those 50 old destroyers continued serving throughout the war. Some survived to see victory. Others were lost in combat or scrapped when they simply wore out. But every one of them played a role in keeping the Atlantic lifeline open during Britain's darkest hour. Historians will always debate whether they were militarily significant, but no one can deny they were symbolically crucial. Let's talk about some of the individuals involved in this story, because behind every great historical event are real people making difficult choices. Franklin Roosevelt was managing not just foreign policy, but his own political survival. He was running for an unprecedented third term in 1940, breaking the two-term tradition established by George Washington. He was navigating between his conviction that America must oppose Hitler and the reality that most Americans wanted to stay out of the war. He was gambling his presidency on decisions that could be vindicated only by future events. Winston Churchill was fighting for his nation's survival, while also trying to preserve Britain's position as a great power. He understood that accepting American aid came with strings attached, that Britain was mortgaging her future independence for present survival. But what choice did he have? Churchill's correspondence with Roosevelt during this period shows a man balancing gratitude with frustration, hope with anxiety, pride with pragmatism. Then there were the military officers who had to implement the deal. Admiral Harold Stark, the chief of naval operations, had reservations about giving away 50 destroyers when America's own navy was preparing for potential war. British Admiral Dudley Pound had to accept ships he knew were obsolete and figure out how to use them effectively. The crews who took those destroyers to sea, British and Canadian sailors, made the deal real through their skill and courage. And what about the ordinary citizens? The American taxpayers who owned those destroyers had no say in their transfer. The British civilians enduring the Blitz had no idea their government was negotiating away imperial territories. Democracy was tested by the secret nature of the negotiations. Yet in the end, democratic nations found a way to cooperate against totalitarianism, even if the process was imperfect. As we reflect on this story decades later, what lessons can we draw? The Destroyers for Bases deal teaches us about the complexity of neutrality in modern warfare. It shows us that international crises often require creative diplomatic solutions. It demonstrates that democratic leaders sometimes must act ahead of public opinion when they perceive existential threats. It reminds us that alliances are built through concrete actions, not just shared values. The deal also raises uncomfortable questions about democracy and executive power. Should Roosevelt have sought congressional approval? Did the urgency of the situation justify bypassing normal democratic processes? How much deception is acceptable when a leader believes they are acting in the national interest? These questions don't have easy answers. They remain relevant today whenever presidents commit American power abroad. We should also consider the deal's role in shaping the post-war world. The Anglo-American alliance, forged in 1940 and 1941, became the core of the Western coalition that won World War II and then faced down Soviet communism during the Cold War. The special relationship between Britain and America, often referenced by politicians, was born in those desperate months when Roosevelt sent old ships and Churchill gratefully accepted them. That relationship has endured through decades of changing circumstances. The bases themselves became lasting symbols of American power projection. The ability to maintain military facilities around the world, to extend American reach far beyond American shores, became a defining feature of American grand strategy. You can draw a line from the bases acquired in 1940 to the global network of American military installations that exists today. For students of military history, the destroyer deal is a case study in how military hardware interacts with strategy and politics. The ships were tools, but their transfer was a political and strategic act. Understanding this distinction helps us analyze other instances where weapons transfers have shaped international relations, from Cold War arms deals to modern military aid packages. The story also reminds us that history often turns on narrow margins and individual decisions. If Roosevelt had been more cautious, if Churchill had been more proud, if isolationist opposition had been stronger, the deal might never have happened. Britain might have fallen or been forced to negotiate with Hitler. The entire course of the 20th century could have been different. We live in the world created by the choices made in the summer and fall of 1940. There's something poignant about those old destroyers themselves. They were built for one war, sat forgotten for 2 decades, then suddenly called back to service in another war. They were obsolete but necessary. They were American-built but British-manned. They represented obsolete technology pressed into service by desperate need. In a way, they symbolized the improvisation and determination that characterized the Allied war effort. If you visit naval museums today, you can sometimes find artifacts from these ships. A brass plate, a ship's bell, a section of deck railing. These fragments connect us to that pivotal moment. They remind us of the sailors who served aboard these vessels, hunting submarines in the cold Atlantic, enduring storms and attacks, keeping the convoys moving. Those sailors rarely get the recognition they deserve, but without them, all the grand strategy and political negotiations would have meant nothing. The Battle of the Atlantic lasted the entire war, from September 1939 to May 1945. It was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. Over 70,000 Allied seamen died, along with 30,000 German submariners. More than 3,000 merchant ships were sunk. The statistics are staggering. And through all of it, the destroyers transferred in 1940 played their part, one convoy at a time, one U-boat forced to dive, one group of merchant ships shepherded safely to port. When we think about pivotal moments in World War II, we often picture dramatic battles. Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, Stalingrad, D-Day, the Bulge. But the Destroyers for Bases deal reminds us that some of the most important moments happened in government offices and shipyards, through negotiations and compromises, through leaders making hard choices about resources and risks. As we conclude this journey through history, it's worth asking what Destroyers for Bases means for us today. We live in another era of global uncertainty, of rising powers and shifting alliances, of debates about America's role in the world. The questions Roosevelt faced are still with us. How should democracies respond to distant threats? When should we aid allies? How do we balance ideals with interests? What price is worth paying for security? The destroyer deal offers no simple answers to these questions. It does offer a reminder that leadership sometimes requires acting on conviction when popular opinion lags behind. It shows us that alliances require sacrifice from both sides. It demonstrates that symbolic gestures can carry enormous practical weight, and it proves that old ships can carry the weight of history. So here's where we end. On the deck of HMS Campbellton, formerly USS Buchanan, in 1942. This destroyer, transferred in the 1940 deal, is approaching St. Nazaire at high speed, loaded with explosives. Her mission is to destroy the dock gate, and she will succeed spectacularly. The ship that Britain received as a desperate stopgap will perform one of the war's most legendary raids. From obsolete cast-off to immortal weapon, from American to British to eternal. That transformation captures the spirit of the entire Destroyers for Bases story. 50 old ships, 8 base leases, 1 pivotal deal. The agreement that saved Britain, empowered America, and changed the world. That's the legacy of Destroyers for Bases, a chapter of history that deserves to be remembered.